This conference will now be
All
recorded.
right, so just a little bit to finish up last couple little bits of slides here from the digestive system itself. We hadn't really gotten into when things begin to decline, right? So old age stuff. As you get older, your GI tract itself becomes less motile. It moves things less efficiently. You produce less gastric and intestinal juice. Um, as a result, digestion and absorption are both less efficient than they were when you were at your age, I guess. And so that, does of course mean that you're going to not be able to eat the sorts of things you used to eat when you were 20, when you're 40. It just simply doesn't work as well. One of the other things that happens as a result out of this, right, is that we often see, particularly in geriatric populations, we see constipation becoming a real issue. There's a reason that grandma and grandpa are forever eating bran cereal and prunes and things like that. They are suffering from a lessened motility of the intestine, and thus simply aren't moving things along as well as they used to. The other thing is that as you get older, your sense of taste, your sense of smell both decline, right? So again, if you've ever been over to grandma's house and wondered why everything didn't have any seasoning on it, right? Wow, she can't taste anything anyway, so everything more or less tastes pretty bland. Other big things that happen here, diverticulosis and diverticulitis. Diverticulosis is when you have one of those house drugs that kind of gets stretched out. And it forms kind of a side chamber on the colon, right? And the danger there, of course, is that that side chamber can get filled with feces and not go anywhere. And if it becomes irritated, if you get diverticulitis, which is the inflammation of a diverticulum, that can actually rupture and cause you all sorts of problems. So, and that is something that is associated with old age. We also see fecal incontinence. So not only do you become constipated, but when you do finally manage to move things along far enough, you lack the ability to hold it back until you're ready to go. So getting old is not romantic in any way, shape, or form. And of course, as you get older, cancers of all forms become more common, especially cancers of the GI tract. The dangers with these cancers are that, unlike, say, skin cancer or really any other kind of cancer, we don't have a lot of early warning. Right? These things tend to hide and only begin noticeable when the pathology has progressed to a point that it's maybe too far along. One of the reasons that these sorts of cancers are so often lethal is because we don't see them in time to treat them. So honestly, your best bet in terms of keeping these things at bay are regular dental exams. Your dentist should be doing a cancer screening every time he or she gets into a mouth, and colorectal exams. Colorectal exams are really only more concern for people in sort of the 45 and up demographic, but you will want to begin making those appointments when you are that old. Okay, so that's more or less the parts and the processes. Okay, from there, we need to talk a little bit about the how. What are we bringing in? What are we doing with it? What's the importance of all these different things that come into it? Nutrition, basically. And what this comes down to is that most of the stuff that you are eating, digesting, and absorbing, most of that goes into production as energy for life, right? For growth, for maintenance, anything that we need to make ATP for, right, is where most of these calories end up going. We do have some for repair, right? And actually a surprising amount of energy goes into tissue repair. And we're going to measure, if I can find my cursor, there we go. We're going to measure these units of energy in kilocals or kcals, or if you see the word calorie written with a capital C, it is also a kcal or a kilocal. A calorie written with a lowercase c is 1/1000th of an uppercase C cal. So it's a very small unit of measurement. So for our purposes, for nutritional purposes, we rely on the kilocal to do that. And it's kind of an arbitrary number, right? It's the amount of energy you need. 1 kilogram of water to make it 1 degree warmer centigrade, but it's the unit that we use. Nutrients themselves, right, is just whatever it is that we've digested out, broken down. These qualify under multiple different categories, right? We can talk about them as major nutrients, right? Which are 3: carbs, fats, proteins. And those are going to make up the bulk of the food that you eat. The reason they're going to make up the bulk of the food that you eat is that the bulk of the organisms that you're eating, plants or animals, are made out of those things. There are some other things, right? Micronutrients, minor nutrients, whatever you want to describe them as, that you do also need, okay? But not nearly in the same amounts because they're not really quite as important in terms of structure for your body as maybe some of these major nutrients are. So these will be things like vitamins and minerals. Technically, in order to make all this work, we need water, so water is technically a nutrient, but we are, for the purposes of this chapter, really just not going to talk about it. We've kind of done the water thing. We don't need to come back to it anymore. Now, we are going to come back and talk about the largest gland in your body, right, the liver. We've talked about the liver before in terms of its role in producing bile, right? The liver also is kind of a metabolic miracle. The things that you eat, right, you might eat a particular carbohydrate, right? So you might eat something that has fructose, but you don't need fructose, you need glucose. So what are you going to do? Well, what your liver does is it metabolizes that fructose into glucose. Or if you have one amino acid, right, and you don't need that one, but you need a different one, your liver can metabolize that first amino acid into a second. Right? It can convert almost everything that we need from the things that we get in our diet. Okay? However, there are a subset of things, fatty acids, amino acids, things of that nature. There are certain carbs that your liver can't. You lack an enzyme to make that particular nutrient. Okay? And these are what we call essential nutrients. Now, one of the tricky parts about this, right, is that in sort of modern usage, we use the term essential to mean something that is needed, right? Well, this term came about prior to that usage, right? And it has sort of an older meaning. And that same older meaning is what we find in like essential oils, right? Essential as in the essence of, right? And so an essential nutrient is something that we have to get in that exact form. We can't make it ourselves. So if you need an omega-3 fatty acid, you have to eat an omega-3 fatty acid. If you want any of the essential amino acids, you have to eat that particular one. So it doesn't mean that it's required. They are, but there are lots of non-essential nutrients that are also required. It's just things that we can't make on our own, and so we need them in our diet. And that's going to come back a little bit here, especially when we start talking about proteins because it has profound impacts on what your dietary choices are. But we're going to begin instead with the largest component of your diet and the largest requirement in your diet, which are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are largely derived in the human diet from plant materials. They come in a couple of different forms, so we can find them in starches, right, or complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates are just exactly what they sound like. They're just long chains of monosaccharides put together. So they're bigger molecules, really, is all that is. And these are going to be things that we find in plant parts. Okay, so vegetables, which is roots, tubers, and stems and leaves. Okay, we find them in grains, which are seeds. Right? We also get simple carbohydrates, so monosaccharides like glucose or fructose, disaccharides from fruits. Okay, so your berries, your palms, your other fruiting bodies, all of those will provide you, tomatoes will provide you with sugars. We also, of course, can get sugars from animal products as well. So honey is technically a animal product. Milk, obviously, an animal product too. So we do get some of those simple sugars from animal parts as well. You can get, if you have a steak, you will get some simple sugars from the glycogen stored in the muscle tissue, but it's not a huge. The issue with carbs, okay, is that a lot of times it comes in what we call fiber. Okay? And fiber is what gives a plant part structure. So the cell walls of plants, right? Human animal cells don't have walls, but plant cells do. The walls of those cells are made out of something called cellulose. And cellulose is something that we cannot digest. This is a little problematic because all of the nutrients in that plant are inside the cells, and if we can't digest the cell wall, we can't get at them. So things that are in this sort of cellulose framework, right, are undigestible, right? Insoluble is the term that we use for this. And so things that are made out of cellulose are part of this insoluble fiber group. And what is it called? Roughage, right? This is really just something to help move fecal matter along the way. Right? It's something to help bowel movements progress, really what it comes down to. There are, however, structural carbohydrates in plants that are soluble and are actually quite good for you. So this will be things like pectin, right? So when you bite into an apple and it's crisp, right? That tissue in the apple is built on pectin. The same thing too for citrus fruits, your apples, your oranges, your oranges, your lemons, your limes, your grapefruit, things like that. This pectin is something that you can digest, and in fact is something that can be useful in terms of reducing serum cholesterol levels. So it is of some significant value to us. As far as what we use carbs for, well, a couple of different things. Primarily here, we use carbs in the process of making ATP. Some cells in your body can only use carbs, right? So your nervous system cannot run on anything other than glucose. Other cells in your body can run on other things. Right? Your heart tissue, for example, loves to run on lactic acid instead of glucose. Happy to do it. Okay? Other parts of your body will use fats instead of lactic acid or glucose or any of these other things. Okay? But that's its primary use, right, is for the production of ATP. Glucose itself is water soluble, right? So it's not stable long term. Okay? So if we have extra and we need to store it, we have to convert it to a different form. So we first move excess glucose into the liver, where we turn it into glycogen, which is a big chain of glucose molecules. That's a little more stable. But if it needs to be stored for weeks, days, okay, we're actually going to convert it to fatty acids and ultimately into triglycerides instead. We'll talk a little bit later in this chapter about kind of the conversion of fats to sugars and back and forth. It's actually really, really simple to do, and so it's a very, very convenient mechanism for us to both store energy for the long term and pull energy out of storage and use it now. Because because your nervous system cannot run on anything else, okay, we do have minimum levels of daily carbohydrate intake. We're looking at about, for the average person, and I do need to stress at this point, these numbers are based around a man who is 5'9" and 160 pounds. I am not 5'9" or 160 pounds. None of you guys are math. So this does not directly apply to anybody in this room, and none of the numbers that I give you will necessarily directly apply to anybody in this room. So I don't want anybody taking these numbers and going home and setting out a diet plan for themselves. This is what I got to do, because it's not. Okay, these are generalities. Okay, if you want to have a specific diet plan, please talk to a dietitian. Please talk to a doctor, your GP, whoever. Don't take these numbers as what every person's got to have, because there is a lot of wiggle room, a lot of variance in and around these numbers. So they're just kind of in the middle of the cloud, so to speak. Okay. But that said, right, we're looking at, for the average person, somewhere around 100 grams of carbs a day just to keep your brain moving. Okay. A minimum, a recommended minimum, right, somewhat above that, is about 130 grams. Again, just in terms of trying to keep your brain peppy, right? In terms of your overall total diet, and this is a number that can be applicable, right? We're looking at, somewhere in the neighborhood of about half, maybe a little more than half of your diet should come, or calories anyway, should come in the form of carbs, right? And with that said, right, we would prefer that those carbs are in the form of complex carbohydrates and not like candy bars, right? So whole grains, vegetables, fruits, okay, less fruits, you can get some heck down there, but vegetables and whole grains in particular is what we're striving for. If you find yourself, say, on a desert island, right, and you're not able to meet that minimum requirement for carb intake, your brain will do what it needs to keep itself alive, which is to take energy from other sources. So we will begin the process of converting fats to glucose, to something we're going to call gluconeogenesis. We're going to convert proteins to carbs if we need to do so. So we do have mechanisms for doing this in emergency situations, but it's not necessarily a great outcome for us to do it. The average American diet is actually a little light on carbs. We prefer to see more of your diet in carbs here. That said, these are percentages and not volumes. So one of the reasons that the American diet is relatively low in carbs is because it's relatively high in other things that we shouldn't be eating. So it's not that you should rush out and eat more carbs. You're probably getting certainly an adequate amount of carbs. But the other things, particularly fats, make up a much larger proportion of diet than it should. One of the things that we see with diet here, particularly with carbs, is there's also a strong socioeconomic factor. We find people that are in lower economic brackets tend to have a more carb-rich diet, in large part because things that are carb-rich are cheaper. You can feed a family for a long time with a bag of rice. Pasta is cheap. Bread is cheap. Bread can be cheap, but sometimes it's not. But the bread my child insists on buying certainly is not cheap. But these things tend to make up larger components of lower income diets for that reason, which may also play a role in greater incidence of obesity in lower income brackets. Potentially really. With fats, we get a couple of different sources for this depending on what kind of fat we're talking about. So our neutral fats, right, triglycerides, come in two forms. There are saturated and unsaturated fats. Maybe not as different as you thought. We'll talk a little bit about that end of the chapter here. But saturated and unsaturated fats come from typically from different sources. Okay, saturated fats tend to be animal fats. Okay, so we get them from meat, from dairy products. We do also get them from things like coconut and palm oil. Okay, so they do exist in plants as well. Unsaturated fats are almost invariably plant material. So fats we get out of seeds, so almond oil, olive oil, things of that nature. Most of your vegetable oils, I don't know if canola oil is or not, but most of your other oils at least are unsaturated. And then of course we also get, excuse me, lipids in the form of cholesterol. Cholesterol from egg yolks, from meat, particularly from organ meat. So if you eat livers, gizzards, or any number of other bits of organ meat, tripe, if you live in a Hispanic community and you eat tripa a lot, you'll get a lot of cholesterol from that. Delicious, but it is cholesterol full. Shellfish, okay, milk, all of these things have a significant amount of cholesterol. And the issue with that for us is that your liver manufactures most of the cholesterol you need. Your liver makes about 85% of your daily cholesterol requirement, regardless of how much cholesterol you eat. So if you eat 20% of your daily cholesterol intake, your liver makes 85, and you have excess cholesterol. If you eat 10% of your cholesterol intake, your liver makes 85. You get 95% of your cholesterol intake. So it's a very tricky thing to do to sort of fit the amount of cholesterol you get kind of in an appropriate window. It's very easy to go under, and it's very easy to go over. And in particular, when people go over, that's when we start seeing a lot of health problems, because it is so very easy to do. Now, this is where we're going to see really the first of the important essential nutrients. Okay? Your liver can convert almost any fatty acid into something that we can use. Okay? There are, however, two fatty acids that we cannot produce, and we must get from sources. There's actually more than two, but these are two that are very, very important for us. These are linolenic and linoleic acid. Okay. The good news about linoleic and linolenic acid is that we can get them from most of your vegetable oils. So it's really not a hard thing to come by getting. We also lack the enzyme to make omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. But we can get those from our diet as well, particularly in cold water fish. Is an easy source of those. Fish oils in general are good sources of those omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. What do we do with them? Well, there's lots of different reasons, or lots of different uses that we can have. If you remember cell biology at all, right? The cell membrane itself is made out of a lipid, right? Those phospholipids in your cell membrane come from somewhere, and they come from other triglycerides. Now, we also rely heavily on lipids to fuel skeletal muscles. That's a preferred source of energy for skeletal muscle. We use fats to absorb certain micronutrients, so there are fat-soluble vitamins that we do require fat to absorb. We use fat to produce prostaglandins, which is a blood pressure protein. We make fat tissue or adipose tissue out of fat, right? Which is useful as an insulator. It's useful as a storage for energy. It's useful as a protection mechanism. Lots of different things that go into that. And then cholesterol, we use cholesterol to make steroid hormones. We use cholesterol to stabilize parts of cell membranes. We use cholesterol to make bile. Lots and lots of different uses for that as well. So we do need these things. They are vital to moment-to-moment, day-to-day life. They're not a throwaway kind of thing. In terms of dietary intake, right, we'd like to see less than 30% of your calories as fat, right? That's kind of a good number to shoot for. The problem is that the typical American diet is over 40 and usually well over 40% fat, which is what's pushing that carb percentage down. It's not that the amount of carbs we're eating is not enough, it's that we're eating too much fat, is really what it comes down to. The AHA does have some guidelines here about certain forms of fat, saturated fats, cholesterol. The saturated fat one, 10% of total fat intake, is probably not a bad idea, but the science is kind of coming around to the idea that there's not as profound a difference in the processing of saturated and unsaturated fats as we thought, and so this might not be as important. It's probably still a good idea. Reducing the amount of intake of the things that contain saturated fats is probably not bad, eggs and meat, things like that. So I wouldn't say it's a bad recommendation, but the science behind it may be not as strong as we once thought. And then, of course, cholesterol, we have a good firm limit on that, under 3 mg a day. Again, because we know how much you're going to need, because your liver is going to make a certain amount of it no matter what you do. Your primary goal for cholesterol counts is to keep your total cholesterol below about 200 mg per deciliter, which is a pretty good number to shoot for. But most people today, particularly people my age and older, don't manage that. So here's the issue. Fats are delicious, right? Fats make everything better. They do. There's just no getting around it. They're wonderful, right? But they're also not great for you in mass quantities. And so typical American ingenuity, right? We've tried to come up with things that taste like fat, but don't have the negative consequences, right? So the production of lots and lots of these fat substitutes has come around. One of the things that we see a lot being done now is whipping foods, feeding air into them to make them lighter. If you've ever, and this actually can have a pretty big difference, right? If you've ever eaten ice cream, right? Ice cream, when it's first made, right, and it's been kept frozen the whole time, is wonderful. It tastes amazing, right? If ice cream melts and then you refreeze it, it tastes like ass, right? Because the air that was whipped into that ice cream is no longer there. You've melted it, it's all escaped, right? It tastes quite different. And so whipping foods has a pretty good, powerful effect on increasing taste. Okay, so that's one particularly good option. We've tried to modify various starches and various gums. We've added milk whey protein as a substitute for fat. If you've ever had whey protein, like in its normal form, it's like a pre-gym kind of thing people do or post-gym, it's terrible. It is one of the single worst things I've ever put in my body. It's awful. Right? So it's not really doing much for the flavor here, is what I'm saying. And then we come to olestra. And olestra was a fat derivative made from cotton seeds. And so it's a vegetable. And this was going to be the big thing. So you guys are probably too young to remember this. Late 90s, I believe it was Frito-Lay, I can't remember, made this big push. They were going to put olestra in all of their chips, and everybody was going to be happy and fat-free and wonderful. And the reason that this was supposed to work is that olestra is something your body can't break down. So it has no caloric value whatsoever. It just passes right through your body and out the other side. The downside to this is that olestra just passes through your body and right out the other side. It doesn't change form. And so one of the things, and I apologize, but this is, I swear to God, the actual term, and they use this on the news every night for months, it caused anal leakage. This oil was seeping out of your body through your colon, and people were unable to prevent it from escaping, so to speak. And this was a big deal, right? Because people, generally speaking, don't want to have stuff leaking out of their backside. And so they had to go back and retool. Apparently they did. They still make products with Olestra today. I am traumatized by the idea of that, so I personally can't go back and eat them. I don't know if they're any good or not, but I do know they are still being made. The downside to a lot of these things is that they taste like shit. They just really don't taste good, right? Fat tastes delicious, and these things aren't fat, and they don't taste good. That was the one upshot of Olestra, right? Was that it was supposed to taste really good. Whether or not that's worth the consequences, I suppose up to you. I don't know. But that's really the big problem with most of these fat substitutes. Okay? A lot of them, they sort of like whey protein denatures at heat or with the addition of heat, so you can't cook with it, which is half the joy of having fats in your diet, is being able to cook with them. And the other shot, of course, is that we need fat. Right? We require fat. It serves vital purposes, right? The absorption of beta carotene, absorption of various fat-soluble vitamins and minerals and drugs and all these other things that we require. And so if we don't have fats in our diet, we can't do that, and we're kind of in trouble. And finally, the last of the major nutrients to your proteins. Okay? Proteins come in two forms. We have what we call complete proteins, and then we have incomplete proteins. Animal products are going to contain complete proteins, and many plant products, but not all, will have incomplete ones. And what defines a complete protein is that it has all of the essential amino acids in it. Okay? So you don't have to eat from a menu of things. If you want all of your essential amino acids, you can go have a steak and you will get all of those amino acids. And so this is going to be things, again, like animal products, right? So eggs, meat, fish, milk, okay, but also soybeans. So tofu, other soy-derived products also contain complete proteins. So if you want to eat a plant-based diet, or you want to have conscious consumption of meat and kind of reduce the amount of meat you eat in a week, you can still get complete proteins without having to go to multiple sources, just by eating soy-based products, which are sometimes good and sometimes awful, like everything else. For other plant-based products, you're going to have to eat a mixture of things. Okay? You're going to have to eat beans and nuts and cereals all together. Okay? Because each of those different groups contains some, but not all, of the essential amino acids. Okay? And the good thing is, right, if you eat beans and cereal grains together, there's enough overlap there that you'll get all of those essential amino acids. So again, you can do a plant-based diet, or even a largely plant-based diet, without too much effort, but you do have to think about it. There is a little more effort to it beyond just saying, I'm not going to eat meat anymore. You have to really pay attention to what you're getting, more so than you would otherwise. Now, as for what we're doing with these things, we use proteins primarily to build our bodies. Okay, they are important elements of structural stuff. So they form collagen, which is the biological component of bone, the structural component in most of your dermis. Okay? We also use it to form elastin, which makes up the bulk of the remainder of the derma tissue. We use it to make keratin, which you find in your skin, your hair, your nails. We use it to build muscle out of. It's basically what you're made out of is protein. We also use a lot of proteins for enzymatic activity, right? So all of the different chemical reactions in your body that are catalyzed, all of those enzymes are proteins. A number of hormones, so we have steroid hormones that are cholesterol-based, and a lot of the other hormones are protein-based, at least at some level. So they might be an amino acid, they might be part of an amino acid, they might be a whole protein. But they're all built out of proteins and protein derivatives. And then in emergency situations, this is not the preferred method for anything, but this is sort of a last-ditch effort. We can, through a fairly lengthy process, convert amino acids into a form that we can use to make ATP. It's more work than we would do otherwise, so we don't do a lot, but we can do it. Now, the tricky thing with proteins here is that we don't store them. You do not store amino acids in your body. Okay? You eat them and you use them, or they go away. Simple as that. And that presents a little bit of a problem for us, right? Because when we start trying to make a protein, we don't start a protein, realize we're missing something, and hold on to it until we get that amino acid we need in stock. If we start a protein and that protein is 475 amino acids long, and we get to 474 and we're missing an amino acid, we scrap the entire thing, we burn all 474 of those amino acids for fuel, and we're out of luck. Okay? So when we talk about getting complete proteins, right? When we talk about having a diet that contains all of the essential amino acids, this is why this is so important, right? Because if the one that we're lacking is one of those amino acids that's essential, we're out of luck. And we might be really out of luck because that thing that we're trying to make might be really important. Okay? So again, when you think about trying to compose your diet, amino acids, essential amino acids, need to be a part of that. Don't talk about this. Worry about that. Okay. Actually, we'll come back to this slide. I want to show you this here first, because this is the list of essential amino acids. So there's a lot of these things on here that are relatively important. Tryptophan is a precursor to melatonin. Methionine is something that we use to end coding of genes. Valine, threonine, phenylalanine, leucine, isoleucine, lysine. Lysine in particular plays a fairly important role in cellular processes. These are things that as adults, we cannot manufacture. Okay? As infants, we have two additional essential amino acids that we cannot make, histidine and arginine. As we age, we gain the ability to make an enzyme that will convert those, so we can make those later, but when we are first hatched, we cannot. And the breakdown here that we've got, right, is where we're going to get these from in a plant diet. So our grains here, so things like corn or wheat or whatever, contain some of these, right? Tryptophan, methionine, valine, threonine, phenylalanine, leucine, okay, but not isoleucine or lysine. And beans contain isoleucine and lysine, but not tryptophan or methionine. So if we eat both of those together, we get all of them. That's why that's so important. Now, in terms of control of protein use in the body, we think about anabolic hormones, things that are going to be building processes. Remember we talked way back in AFB1 about anabolic versus catabolic. Anabolic are processes that build. Okay? So your anabolic hormones, so growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen, what have you. Okay? These are going to be hormones that accelerate the building of tissue. And when we build tissue, right, we do so by making proteins. On the other hand, right, part of our stress response, you recall, right, was the release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. Okay? And part of what those glucocorticoids are doing, right, is stimulating the breakdown of proteins. They are catabolic sorts of things. So glucocorticoids are catabolic hormones, growth hormone, sex hormones are anabolic hormones. Now, again here, right, in terms of dietary needs, This one in particular is hard to gauge, right? Because this one really more than the others is extremely physiology dependent. Right? Men typically need more than women. Younger people need more than older people. Larger people need more than smaller people, right? All of these things play a factor. But a good sort of rule of thumb here, right, is if you can manage about a little less than a gram per kilogram of body weight, you're probably doing okay. And of course, the upshot of that here is that, generally speaking, the American diet gives us way more protein than we need. In large part because we eat a lot of meat. We eat meat usually at least a couple times a day and almost every day, right? It's rare for the American diet to not contain meat at least once in a meal. And that, historically speaking, is very unusual. Okay? So it is perhaps something to consider. On to some of the sort of minor nutrients here, things like vitamins. Vitamins are going to be organic, which is to say they are derived from living things. Living things make vitamins. This is going to help distinguish them from minerals, which are inorganic. Really the big difference between the two. And what we need vitamins for usually is kind of, they serve as like little helpers. They work as coenzymes. They work in terms of helping us absorb various other nutrients. And the weird thing about vitamins is that we really don't make very many. We more or less just make vitamin A from beta carotene and vitamin D. We get some of the B vitamins. We get vitamin K, again, like we talked about, from bacteria in our colon, right? But for the most part, vitamins that we get, we have to eat. And one of the confounding parts about this is that it's what really stresses the importance of a balanced diet, because no one food group has all of them, right? You got to eat plants, you got to eat milk products or animal products of some sort. You got to eat all these different things, right, to get all of these things. They come in two forms, depending on what they dissolve in. So there are water-soluble vitamins, which dissolve in water, as you might guess. These are things like B vitamins and C vitamins. The thing with water-soluble vitamins is you don't store them. Okay? So when you bring them into your body, you use them or you urinate them, right, within an hour. Okay? So, and again, I have on occasion gotten up on my high horse here a little bit. I'm going to do so here too. I hate multivitamins. I think they are the biggest scam on the universe, because what a multivitamin is a megadose of a lot of these vitamins. You don't use them, okay? You simply don't need them. These things, you are literally taking the money you spent on those vitamins and you are literally peeing them down the toilet. Okay? Now, if you are prescribed a vitamin by a physician, that's a different story. Okay? Things like prenatal vitamins, things like corrective vitamins for various mineral deficiencies, those are important. Do not let me tell you otherwise. If you've been advised to take one, please continue to take it. But if you've not been advised to take one, Flintstones Chewables has warped the generations of this America, and I'm telling you, they are not something that you need. Right? A megadose of this stuff is useless. It's the same deal with Emergency. Right? I get sick, I love Emergency. It's warm, it tastes good, it makes me feel better, but that vitamin C is not staying in my body doing any job. It is going right out of my body the same way it does yours. Okay? So just bear that in mind. The other version of this are fat-soluble vitamins. So these are A, D, E, and K. And these are stored in the body because they're stored in fat. However, we also don't want megadoses of A, D, E, or K, because A, D, E, or K, they don't go away. So if you have a megadose of it, you store large quantities of it, and excess amounts of any of these are often resulting in pathologies. They are going to be bad for you in the long run. So Again, there's really no upshot to having a lot of excess vitamins in your body. It's either wasted or it's going to make you sick. So I would strongly recommend against doing this. Okay. On Monday, we'll come back. We'll talk about what vitamins do in your body. We'll talk about free radicals, all that kind of fun stuff. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.